Yeah. Thanks so much. Sorry, I just got a reminder there. Thank you, Al. Okay,
And it's
perfect.
always good. Yeah. My name is Ciara. Just joining the recording. My name is Ciara Breen, and I'm an occupational therapist with Bri Clinic, which is my own private practice. And I suppose, my caseload probably is around 75-80%. Long COVID, ME, maybe Lyme, some associated conditions and presentations, but very much sort of within that space of prolonged fatigue, and also, I suppose, that disruption to the immune system, the inflammation, everything that goes along with that as well. So, and then I work for the HSE as well, but I suppose really what I'm here to talk about today is really around the long COVID piece of it. I'm really delighted to kind of answer questions. I have sort of put maybe 5 or 6 slides together just to, I suppose, contextualize for people who maybe aren't maybe coming at this with a whole lot of the terminology like post-exertional malaise or pacing or any of those kind of things, just to, I guess, put us all on the same page for the starting maybe 5-10 minutes of this presentation, and then throw the floor open, throw the questions at me, and listen, I'm really happy to answer anything that's within my scope of practice. So I suppose just people who are maybe formulating questions, I'm not a prescriber, so I can't answer specific medication or dosage sort of questions, but certainly as I'll explain, I suppose OT is very much around a lot of the non-pharmacological, so things that we do in terms of how we structure our day, our activities, impacts and kind of how we manage our energy over that 24-hour period, so yeah.
That's probably a good starting point, actually. I suppose, what is the role of occupational therapy in the management of long COVID? But you're probably going to, address that. And we thought a couple of slides would be a good way to just kick off things and get people's brains kind of turned on. And we've had a few questions submitted in advance. So, and also feel free to submit your questions through the chat and I'll collect them. So yeah, over to you, Ciara. Thanks so much.
Perfect. That sounds great. Yeah. All right. Let's see if the slide share. That's always the fun part. And we had a little test run, but of course, now that this is recording, Sarah, it may or may not do it, but we're doing pretty good. There we go.
Okay. Says you started sharing. Oh, here they are. Yeah, perfect.
There we go. If that's come up, that's brilliant. So I suppose really zoning in a lot, the scope of occupational therapy is pretty wide, but I suppose really for tonight and certainly the starting point for a lot of conversations, I think, in occupational therapy, very much zoning around pacing. But it's not the only thing. I suppose it's not the only tool in terms of energy management, but it is a real biggie. And I think, as you say, Sarah, it's a real challenge to figure out through the advice, what path do I go on here? How do I begin to try to get some stability in a very mesmerizing sometimes range of symptoms? Where do I catch the end of the thread to start unraveling this, and so definitely as an occupational therapist working in the area, and this wouldn't be as an occupational therapist, but certainly I think spotting patterns, spotting linkages between one thing and the next thing, and beginning to kind of explore, educate, support, and really collaboratively problem solve with the person with long COVID. And that would be very much my approach, sort of to kind of collaborate to kind of come up with some solutions together that feel manageable and that feel a good starting point for that person. But almost always the starting point, as I say, is really getting a handle around post-exertional malaise, because very much that runs through and I think determines the next step in terms of where we would go. So OT, lots of experience in loads of different areas, but I suppose that interest in specialism around fatigue, sleep, and cognitive functioning. So I suppose that has led me here in many respects, because long COVID, like ME, has these three in abundance. Not only these three issues, as we know the range of symptoms is very vast, but certainly in high numbers. We see people with a lot of fatigue, sleep disorder, which is related in some cases to some daytime sleepiness, but also is a distinct element of long COVID, and then cognitive functioning, so the so-called brain fog. But actually really in many cases is a very debilitating cognitive dysfunction. So really trying to disentangle, is this cognitive fatigue? Is it a cognitive dysfunction in a particular area? And if so, what do we do about it? And then just to raise the flag for long COVID physio, who have a load of resources and lots and lots of helpful videos and fact sheets and things like that. So I'm an occupational therapist, I'm not a physio, but I'm a member of their Allied Health Committee. And when I begin talking about post-exertional malaise, I will be talking a little bit about some of the work of some of the members of long COVID physio, particularly Todd Davenport, who is currently our chair of the organisation. So not speaking today on behalf of any of those, but more on behalf of my own good self, and particularly private practice. So you might have heard me and Sarah there just at the beginning discussing about post-exertional malaise. So really, what is this? And this is one of the things that really creates a divergence in, I think, paths, really, in terms of what is the next step, what is the right rehab journey for somebody with long COVID. And approximately, it differs according to the study, of course, but approximately half of people with long COVID have this feature, this symptom called post-exertional malaise. And post-exertional malaise is a worsening of symptoms after even minor exertions. So this is where your symptoms, the symptom profile, changes and worsens as a result of some exertion. So post-exertion. It's sometimes known as post-exertional symptom exacerbation. It's also sometimes known as post-exertional neuroimmune exhaustion, which kind of gives us some indication as to what's happened there. And the triggers can be physical, cognitive, or emotional. And they don't always link that. So a cognitive trigger doesn't necessarily mean you'll have worsening cognitive symptoms. It could mean that you have pain. It could mean that you have fatigue. It could mean that you have tinnitus. So the trigger doesn't always mean that you have the corresponding worsening, which is different in post-exertional malaise. Say, for example, other rehabilitation that I might be involved in. So say, for example, if rehabilitating somebody with stroke or brain injury, if you work a particular area of the body. So for example, if you work quite hard on their arm, then their arm will be tired. It will be quite localized. It will be quite specific to the area that you've been working. Whereas post-exertional malaise is really, I suppose you could consider it a flare or a worsening of the whole symptom profile. And the workload on the right-hand side is from a study of people who described post-exertional malaise to the researchers. And as you can see, this profound feeling of exhaustion just came through in person after person after person. But also we can see just the whole range of things that can go along with that, including some things that wouldn't necessarily be expected. So like changes in body temperature or migraine or insomnia or mood changes. So these can all be associated with this post-exertional malaise. So it's not just tiredness. I could have, title the talk, it's not just tiredness, but definitely tiredness is some way by far underestimating what this is. So recapping again, the key elements are that it's disproportionate to the exertion, and it has this very, very long tail. So the really prolonged recovery, and what this research is suggesting is that it is a real problem with the recovery post-exertion, so that the mechanisms that should go into play once we've had an exertion don't come into play. And so there is this really long recovery from what should have required a very minimal recovery. Another interesting thing is that the onset can be delayed by hours or even days. So it makes it very hard, particularly at the start, to try and figure out what has triggered this. So you just wake up one day feeling awful and you're trying to think back, well, why did it happen today? Is it just a bad day out of my control, or was there something else going on there? So that is, again, as I mentioned, kind of pattern recognition and things like that. And definitely working with clients, and that would be a big part of what I would do to try and help them to identify some of those triggers, and to help them try to understand the relationships between one thing and the next. This is just a slide from a great study, again, which just characterized long COVID in an international group by some really, really good researchers. And again, they're looking, again, really tricky, because when does PIM start? For some people, it starts immediately. For some people, it starts the following day, and that is very typical. For some people, it starts a couple of days later, and others, it just varies. So it's really, really difficult. And even a client I was working with there recently was able to kind of characterize her PIM is really different when she does this task versus this task. And, we're trying to kind of think about kind of really a deep dive into kind of some of those things with her. And then for many, the severity of pain as well is quite marked. So we are talking about not just, a little niggle or something you could kind of ignore or shake off. This is very debilitating, and can mean a prolonged period of recovery, for days, weeks, or unfortunately, sometimes even months or longer. The triggers, of course, are exertion related in many cases. So you can see there in the bottom left, those purple slides, the exercise, physical activity, mental activity, as I mentioned, but also things like stress, things like menstruation, things like consumption of alcohol or caffeine can be a trigger. And definitely, although not today and not in Galway today, heat wouldn't be bothering you, but certainly over recent weeks, we've had sort of an unseasonal, an unusual hot period, and a lot of heat. And certainly heat, particularly heat rather than the cold, but for some people it's the other way around, heat can be a real trigger as well. So just again, another piece from Workwell Foundation, identifying that some people will get immediate triggers, some people will get short term over that 2 to 4 days, and then others will get that longer term. And certainly, if you are interested to read more, put this here, and it might just remind you, go back and have a little look. They have some great fact sheets, some great information sheets in this Workwell Foundation website. This is just a little flag to say it's not all in your head, because I know that sometimes in terms of those mixed messages, they're often coming from maybe people around you, sometimes people, sometimes even healthcare workers who, kind of dismiss or kind of, minimize, I suppose, the impact of post-exertional malaise. What this study did, and goes back a while, but it was one of the very first ones to really highlight this, is to highlight the gene expression post-exertion. So what they did was they got people to exercise, and they looked at some normal controls, and they looked at people with what's called at the time chronic fatigue syndrome, and they looked at the expression of these various different cytokines, so inflammatory markers, and they saw this huge change in difference. So it's not just something that you can, wish away, power through, drive on with. This is a physiological change, a physiological disruption in the body. And you can see there as well that it's not just immediately, but it sort of begins to explain some of this long tail. So even at 48 hours, you can see that is still very much on. So that neuroimmune response to this exertion hasn't switched off, hasn't tapered down. It's still on, it's still high. And that sort of inflammatory and changes that the body is trying to recover through, may be part of the solution, but certainly is part of the reason why post-exertional malaise is there. So pacing, and we'll be talking, I know, in the questions about pacing, but I suppose pacing is essentially about doing differently. So I just picked these 2 days randomly, and you can see on one side there, I did not pace my day at all. So I was kind of doing a little bit of activity here, a little bit of activity there, and then in the evening, for this really big long walk, or well, not really big long walk, but a big long walk relative to the activity in the rest of the day. And then the other day, I did pretty much the same step kind, but actually had spaced it much more over the day. And this is, I think, people kind of think about, oh, pacing is about telling people to do nothing, or telling people not to move, or not to, I think this kind of, some people might think, oh, maybe I shouldn't move at all, or maybe I shouldn't do anything. But actually, really, pacing is about doing differently. And it's about interspersing the activity with rest to make sure you don't hit that threshold where you trigger those additional symptoms. So in some cases, it does mean about doing less, particularly initially to settle down that whole symptom profile. But actually, it doesn't at all mean doing nothing. And I think that sometimes can hold people back from kind of really going into pacing and really kind of figuring out pacing. So what it might mean for you is changing tempo. So instead of charging around, what this doesn't measure is how fast did I walk each of those, say, 500 meters? Was it 2 or 3 minutes here, 2 or 3 minutes there, or did I run to the end of the road and catch a bus? So there's also characteristics around tempo, and particularly things like heart rate monitoring can help with pacing as well, by giving some little bit of biofeedback about how hard the body is working, as well as just simple step counts like this to kind of see, well, actually, I didn't think I was doing more, but hold on a second, I've done 7,000 steps today, whereas normally I do 2.5, So actually sometimes there can be little pieces, little clues that can help us within that. I would say rest is another thing that I work really hard with people on, because we are not good as people in resting. So actually resting is a learned skill. And we often rely, maybe if people haven't been unwell in the past, they may have just relied on sleep as being their sole rest, or maybe they might have relied on sort of resting their active part of their mind, maybe while they're out doing a physical kind of run or something like that. So actually rest changes very much when you're living with it with a long-term illness. And so very often we need to look at the barriers to rest as well, and not only thinking about the skill sets around rest, but also things like guilt, things like shame, things like holding ourselves back from what we need to do because of what we think we should be doing. And there's a lot around that I think is really important to unpack for somebody. Because pacing the activity is only one part of it. Where we need to get is that balance of rest and activity as well. And that doesn't just mean about rearranging the deck chairs on one side of it. It actually means about really resourcing ourselves so that we have those skills for rest, the tools for rest, and that we don't feel bad about applying them to support our health. So I think that's me, really, essentially. So just, final thing was just on occupational therapy. So some of the things that I do, as I say, assessment and support, education, certainly a huge amount of education, individualized pacing, support, cognitive changes, pain management, things like POTS. We haven't mentioned POTS, but it's autonomic changes that also so often go along with long COVID. And then as an OT, I suppose my skill set is around activity analysis as well. So maybe looking at the impact of work on school, increasingly, kind of writing reports around maybe work, SNAs, things like that as well for school. And then I also do both group and one-to-one. So I think especially, one of the things that I am sort of increasingly doing to kind of reach more people and to also, I suppose, make it more affordable are 5-week long group classes. So I suppose what that does is it reduces the cost, number one, but it also means that sort of, there is that little bit of peer support there as well. And those are recorded as well, because I know that symptoms can change day to day. And again, people can access it later or can comment that a little bit later on. So if you want more information, the information is on my website, or please do feel free to reach out. Sleep and rest, as we mentioned, and then primarily I treat people online, but also where necessary, I do home visits, particularly for more severely affected clients, workplace visits, school visits, and so on. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Thank you.
And yeah,
That's
hopefully,
fab. Yeah, a huge amount there. And actually some of the things you said really kind of ring true for me, and that feeling, I suppose, of guilt when you're taking your rest. And for some people it might be kind of that, depending on how, I suppose, severe their long COVID symptoms are, it might be a couple of afternoon, hours in the afternoon or whatever it might be. But to try and kind of think of it as, right now I'm doing my job. This is my job, is to care for myself so that I can function tomorrow to go to work or to mind my children, or but I think it's really difficult because we live in a world where everyone prizes this idea of pushing through regardless of kind of how you feel. And it's really interesting, the study you showed there, around the kind of inflammatory markers, and actually being able to visualize the PEM, because I think all of us, the people on the call, have probably been in a situation where were with a clinician or a doctor who just had never heard of PEM, or maybe doesn't believe in long COVID as a purely physiological illness. But when you're seeing things like this, and you can actually see what PEM is a very real thing. And I know that there's the 2-day CPET test, or which is really interesting. It's 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test, I think,
yeah,
where they can actually see the point on day one, the point at which someone goes into anaerobic energy production, and then on day 2 that happens much sooner, so it actually proves the after effect for that person. And I think in one case in the States, a man actually managed to get his I think his income protection had been declined, and then through the use of the CPET test was able to prove the existence of PEM. Because I think so many times doctors will say to us, oh well, this is subjective. I can't see what you're experiencing, and it's actually really validating to, I think, see data
yeah.
like that. That's, it definitely is. So a couple of questions came in advance of the session, so I'll just start with them. And I think probably, there'll be a lot of people feeling the same kind of, issues or concerns. So how can I do any exercise when I'm so tired? I don't feel safe going out for a walk as my balance is affected. It's a struggle daily.
Yeah, I suppose really what I would say, and I think the issue around exercise comes up a lot because I suppose people think, well, the way to recover from a lot of other illnesses is through exercise, right? So this it must be good for me, to exercise. And I think if you don't kind of understand what's happening within your body, I suppose that makes total sense. Let's try exercise. It's so helpful for so many other things. But actually, if you have post-exertional malaise, the idea of being able to exercise out of that isn't possible. And I think you just mentioned about the CPET there, and the CPET would be where you're sort of doing essentially a stress test, if you like, on an exercise bike hooked up to all these different things. And as you say, then on the second day, your performance drops. So the more you exercise, the worse your performance is. And so the threshold drops and drops and drops rather than increasing, which we would expect to see. So what I would say is, a lot of the time, if you have post-exertional malaise, you are the exception that proves the rule. So absolutely, there are loads of other conditions that exercise is helpful for, but long COVID, particularly if you have PEM, isn't one of them. Now, in terms of getting back to exercise, I think there, like, some people, that is an absolutely huge goal for them. Do you know what I mean? And I think I see it as sort of a marker of recovery. So it's more as I do more, I can begin to consider broadening the repertoire of activities that I can include within my exercise. Exercise can be one of the multiple things that I might choose to do with my energy. But equally, if you choose to use that energy to give your kid a bath, or if you choose to use that energy to go out with your boyfriend, or whatever the case might be, I think it is important to kind of think it's a spend, and it's kind of accounting for that. Then you don't want to put yourself into post-exertional malaise, because the recovery, that long tail, is going to impact on all the other day-to-day functions that you need to do during the day. So I don't know, does that answer the question there? So I suppose really you need to be very, very stable before you would consider really bringing in additional exercise. And certainly you would want to be thinking about, you know, reducing and being very, very aware of what post-exertional malaise is, so that if you do begin to try, you know, trial and error and try, okay, do you know what, maybe I would like to try a bit of a walk, or I would like to try a bit of a swim, or whatever the situation might be, so that you can determine and you can spot it. You know, you can anticipate that I need to watch myself over the next 3 days, see how that was, see if there was any change, and knowing as well that the change could be in any of the symptoms. So it could be that your migraine is back. It could be that your tinnitus is back, even though you're like, you know, I just went for a walk. That shouldn't cause a migraine, but it does from an inflammatory perspective, because it's not just your muscles that are working.
It's a good point. It can be so generalized sometimes. I mean, sometimes people, you know, are like, what does it feel like? And they think I can kind of explain it by it sometimes, like, oh, a really bad flu makes the hangover, but that doesn't really explain it at all. But then sometimes it can also be, so sometimes you've had that thing of, am I getting sick with a bug, or is this PEM? And I think all of us have played that game. But you know, it's kind of, sometimes it can be so specific, as you say. Sometimes it could just be one or two very specific symptoms flaring. And would it be fair to say, Ciara, that I suppose it's so variable in terms of how, you know, severe or mild someone's symptoms might be? So we have, you know, we've long COVID patients who are continuing to work full time, perhaps are managing that, perhaps are struggling with that, all the way through to people who aren't working, have had to stop university, all the way through to severe and very severe. You mentioned they're having to do home visits. I mean, we've people who were completely bedbound, we've people struggling to eat. So I suppose sometimes, you know, in the community we talk about exercise slash movement, because for some people it's moving around their bedroom or moving around in bed if they're that severe. So would you think for some people, I suppose, who are on the very mild end of the spectrum, if they're tolerating a gentle 5 minute, you know, without triggering PEM, I suppose, you know, is the case to say it's not that we're saying exercise is bad, it's about what is safe for you and what doesn't trigger PEM for you?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I always kind of think of it as trying to walk under a doorway, you know, that kind of way. So you don't want to bump your head, you don't want to trigger that PEM. But I think for different people's symptoms and for different degrees of severity, that height is lower, you know, and equally it might be lower at different points, even different points of the month, you know, that kind of way. So just had a client there last week or the week before, and she was like, because she's been journaling, she was like, I can do this in the first week of my cycle, but I can't do it in the latter 2 weeks of my cycle, you know, and it's just, so knowing where that is, and certainly for somebody who is able to manage it, and able to incorporate that within their energy spend for the day, without triggering PEM, absolutely, you know, great. Do you know, I think it's really important that there's hopeful stories out there, and that there's success stories as well, for people who have managed to, but you can never build from instability. And I think that's why I think you have to kind of get to that stable point, first of all, of kind of getting that mastery, if you like, over that pacing, that energy spend during the day. Where are my triggers? Where is my threshold? Where do I tip? Where do I not? Am I resting? Am I recovering? And then you can begin to kind of, from that stable base, then start to explore, you know, little bits. And also I think to not increase too fast, you know, so if you get back doing it, brilliant. But equally, say, even with things like return to work or things like that, I would say don't increase your hours week on week on week. So don't increase your exercise week on week on week. Give it at least a month, you know, really knit that change in, you know, and even ideally kind of, you know, 6 or 8 weeks perhaps, you know, particularly, for example, a return to work program, I'd say, well, stay at that. So you know, they'll agree to you staying at that for 6 to 8 weeks, so that you know you've knitted it into your spend, you know, that you've sort of incorporated it within your spend.
Yeah, Because as you said earlier, the idea of delayed PEM, sometimes we feel it within minutes, sometimes we feel it within hours, other times it can take a day or two.
Yeah.
Particularly if your adrenaline is running. I've definitely found that if going on holiday, sometimes it's actually the last, you kind of adrenaline keeps you kind of going to a certain degree. And then I suppose, so it can be with that delay, sometimes it can be difficult to judge, have I tolerated that or not? And you mentioned there that obviously people's what we kind of sometimes call baseline or their norm, their current long COVID norm in terms of their energy, varies according to the time of the month, but obviously it can also vary, if you've slept badly or if you're battling a cold, or that's the extra challenge, isn't it? Is that it doesn't ever stay completely the same.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Brilliant. So, Ciara has a question here. Is there any evidence to suggest that radical resting actually helps us get out of PEM or even raise a baseline? Is it just something that we feel inherently, or is there anything to show that it actually works? I don't know if yeah, radical resting has been raised a little bit lately.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I don't think the evidence is there. And I think the challenge with any of the research around PEM is ethics to some extent. So you have to induce PEM to study PEM, and I think that's one of the real challenges around post-exertional malaise, around what it is, around differentiating it from normal muscle fatigue or from deconditioning or from anything like that. So there are a lot of unknowns around post-exertional malaise, and certainly that recovery piece, I am not aware of kind of evidence per se, as in like peer-reviewed published papers, but there
Mhm.
is a lot of um, information from the patient community, around recovery, and around kind of getting out of post-exertional malaise. And I would say for anybody who experiences post-exertional malaise, there are two things. So number one, you want to identify your triggers and spend much less time in post-exertional malaise. You know, we can't foresee everything. People, the best, the most knowledgeable people will still sometimes encounter post-exertional malaise. It happens. But actually running against that wall day after day, you're not going to break it down, so we need to kind of come back from that. But in terms of the radical resting, certainly it goes to what is happening within that post-exertional malaise period. And there is obviously this disrupted immune sort of characteristic. And there's also Rob Vust and his team have looked at muscle biopsies as well, where there's actually degrading within the muscle fibers themselves. So there certainly needs to be radical recovery, but I don't know if there needs to be radical. I don't, and I think that might differ for certainly for some people rather than the others. So for some people, radical resting, which is essentially where you do nothing really. You go to bed, you take perhaps fluids, you might take rescue medications, etc. For other people, and I would say it depends on your ability to tolerate that, on a cognitive and mental health basis as well. I think actually making yourself, I think that can sometimes be a real challenge for people. And it reaches a tipping point where I think it can be counterproductive, So for some people, a little bit of gentle movement, by which I mean literally it might be walking around the house, it might be changing position from bed to chair, it might even be just changing position from within the bed. But I think everybody, it's really good for people to have a PEM plan. So, and to communicate that within, your family, if you live within a family, sort of a setup, or to have your kind of rescue box almost, as it were. So do I have, fluids, electrolytes, those sorts of things to help flush through some of the baddies, if you like, the lactate, some of the inflammatory stuff, and try to kind of get back, because fluids are a really, really, really important element of PEM management. And they're also really important, of course, for lots of dysautonomia, POTS for people who have sensitivities around that, but also things like, do you need pain meds? Do you need cold compresses? Those sorts of things. So again, that radical rest as an idea, rather than, but actually what that might look like for different people. For one person, that might be coming downstairs, sitting on the sofa with a light sheet over them. For another person, it might be complete darkness, literally flat, no noise, earphones. So, I do think having some sort of a plan around that is really good.
Yeah. Ciara's saying as well, yeah, the idea of a pen plan, I've never heard that before. I think it's such a good idea. I've definitely heard of patients say, if someone's partner goes out the door every day to work and they're on their own, and on a general day, that's fine and they're managing. But if they're in a very severe crash or an extended period of PEM, I've heard of people, obviously making sure they've got snacks in the bedroom, making sure they've got plenty of water in the bedroom, because even that stairs up and down, and seeing if their partner can help them prepare for the day while they're on their own, to kind of enable them to rest as much as possible. But I think it's when you're speaking, it's really clear that it's really difficult, because we're talking about such a huge range of functioning here, right? I mean, you mentioned sensory sensitivities as part of PEM, and I think a lot of us will remember, that difficulty looking at light and having the curtains closed and the sounds, and if people are downstairs. But we've people, as I said, who are kind of working and who may only be able to pace to some degree, and then we've people who are so ill that, as you say, just going downstairs is kind of the big kind of event for the day. So it's also specific as well. But I think the idea of a PEM plan, regardless of your range of kind of, is a great idea.
And I just love the idea of stations around the house with all those bits anyway. So whether you're in PEM or whether you're just in sort of, just energy saving mode, if we want to call it that, that sort of having your different stations, maybe with your fluids, maybe with like a spare charger, maybe with, some those kind of snacks or whatever you need, like those sorts of stations are really helpful, just from an energy kind of saving point of view. They're often things that I definitely would recommend to people to go, right, buy 4 chargers. Make sure you've got them everywhere. Get your fluids,
definitely. There's a question in the chat there, but actually there was a question that came up with me, with someone who phoned us a little while ago, and I think we maybe should have almost started with that, because it's the person kind of saying, look, if I have a busy life, if I have children and I'm working, how can I distinguish between what is normal fatigue at the end of the day or at the weekends that anyone would have versus PEM? Because I suppose if you've been steadily getting worse and worse, it's going to be difficult to remember what you might have been like a year previously. So how can people, you mentioned that 50% of people have, in your experience of a lot, 50% of people with long COVID have PEM, the others don't. And so maybe the first step then for many is to determine which, and how would you recommend people kind of work that out maybe?
So if you're working with a practitioner, so, of whatever ilk, doctor or physio or, OT, functional med, whatever, anybody can use the PAUL questionnaire, which is a 5-question questionnaire. And then if you answer yes to a certain number of things, then you will move on to the second. So it's a very, very short questionnaire. And certainly I can send that to you, as well. I think you know it anyway, Sarah. But that is one way to look at it. But I think the other big one is to really look, because I think you're absolutely right. And I think sometimes we think of PEM as being PEM, but sometimes it's just PEM and it accumulates, over a period of time as well, and so particularly as a person gets better at pacing, sometimes it's like, am I in PEM or am I just tired? So that's a very, very real question. I think things like checking the pattern, so actually, even if you can log symptoms, even if it's very, very rudimentary, like just a logging kind of a notebook or those sorts of things, where you might have some sort of a tracking thing. And then the other thing, and this is where sometimes I will suggest to somebody, is to have a holiday at home almost. So where they will take a week off, not as a result of being incredibly sick, but sometimes as part of just identifying where is my baseline almost, because I think sometimes when there's so much going on, it can be hard to determine where am I in all this? What is exertion related and what is my baseline? And I think that's a key question. So sometimes we need to turn more than like sort of almost like an elimination diet, if you like. You need to turn the dial right down on activity and go, okay, so now what? And then you can almost begin to kind of see what triggers are really problematic for a given person. So sometimes that can be a really helpful thing, because people say, well, I'm doing nothing. If I hear that, once a week, I'm doing nothing. And then you go, well, tell me about your day. And they go, well, I get up and then I take them to the lunch boxes, and I drive them to school, and then I put them out anyway, and I go to John's, and then I come back and I might do a bit of walk, and then I do the breakfast dishes or that. And it's like 12:30 and they haven't sat down, and they're like doing nothing. So, it's kind of like, what would it be like to actually do nothing, to pretend you weren't there, and to see what sort of that might look like. So that looks different for different people, but I sometimes call it my Victorian Lady Week.
Yeah,
Victorian gents as well also are welcome, but living in there.
Yeah, I mean that's a great idea, because I think often people are surprised. They think, oh wow, I'm feeling great the last 2 weeks, and then it turns out, for whatever reason like that, the opportunity came to have a staycation, and they didn't really put two and two, and they realized, oh, actually it's because I've been doing so much less, and how much PEM was part of what they were feeling and experiencing every day. Yeah, that's a really good idea. So question here around, oh, it's gone. Well, there was a question here. I think someone had asked a question earlier about whether household chores qualify as exercise, which I suppose they do.
Course they do. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, in terms of even showing that step count or things like that, I mean, for loads of reasons, of course, we want to be, moving. It feels good often for our bodies to move. And I think those sorts of things can be really, really useful ways of including a little bit of movement without hitting that threshold, of post-exertional malaise or of worsening. So, but again, it's kind of thinking, I think it's about that. We spoke about it just very briefly at the start about the spoon theory, as one of the examples. So that if you're spending so the spoon theory would be that you've got a limited number of spoons representing your energy sort of budget, if you like, for the day. And that if you spend it in one area, you don't have to spend in the other. So if you woke up with 10 spoons, the dishwasher might be 2 spoons, and then having a shower might be 3 spoons, and having a conversation with your mom might be another spoon. So all those different things that are there. And so definitely for household tasks, I think the issue with household tasks, sometimes people underestimate just how much work is actually within them. And even things like the dishwasher, hanging stuff out, things like that as well, like even the head position can be a real factor. So, maybe kind of sitting to do the dishwasher, to take stuff out of the dishwasher might be, something that you might do on a given day, depending on whether you wanted to save your energy for another thing that you enjoy more than doing emptying the dishwasher, or whether you wanted to maybe avoid things like, some people will have a lot of kind of uncomfortable symptoms with a lot of things, head position changes. So if you imagine taking stuff out of the lower rung of a dishwasher, and head down and then head up, and we're constantly having to kind of, our blood flow is having to constantly change, and that can be very triggering for people who have a lot of kind of more orthostatic sort of issues with their blood pressure, with their blood flow, that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. So the question over email earlier, have you any information on a possible cure for a lingering headache as a result of long COVID? I think this is probably straying into more, traditional kind of the doctor's kind of role. But I mean, I suppose there's a chance that, if someone's headache, migraine is part of that PEM experience. Or do you thoughts on that, Ciara?
Totally. I immediately am thinking of a guy who did 2 year headache, and he had that Victorian Lady Week, 2 weeks actually, and he came off gabapentin, he came off amitriptyline, and
Wow.
so like massive changes. So I do think of it in some ways as a collection of things that sort of hang together rather than these individual kind of things that we sort of need to knock off one by one, because often they're more interrelated than we think.
Mhm.
Um, and then the other thing I would also think always with regards to headache, just because there's so many issues with regards to fluids, is that hydration, and trying to get as much fluid in. So obviously we have people who have things like POTS or orthostatic issues, but also we know that, say, for example, people with ME and very related conditions um, have reduced total blood volume. So they're even more susceptible to dehydration. Um, so again, those sorts of things, just kind of covering those basics as well. But fluids are absolutely, one of the most important things actually, in terms of a non-pharmacological thing.
Mhm.
Or people will be taking salt, for example, but won't be drinking enough, things like that. So actually really making sure people understand what they're on, why they're on it as well. So even though I'm not a prescriber, but just kind of pulling together some threads so sort of the story comes together a bit, because often people are seeing a particular specialist for this, a particular specialist for that, and actually trying to make sense sometimes of, as you say, what can sometimes be conflicting advice.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's not to judge people because, I'm a parent of two children and I know what it's like. And I think when we talk about pacing and we talk about listening to your body, we're talking in this perfect scenario. And obviously we're very conscious that there are people who, are trying to persevere with working because they, feel like they have no choice in regards to their income, or there's people who have small children and,
Yeah.
so I think that a lot of people, if you could wave a magic wand and say, you've all these tasks off your plate, where would, a lot of people would say that some of their symptoms do stabilize, and some, the frequency of headaches, the frequency of migraines might change, if you're able to make those changes to lifestyle. But from speaking to people, we speak to a lot of people, I know a lot of people are still trying to keep maintaining their pre long
Yeah.
COVID life for a variety of reasons, and it's very obviously very challenging. Yeah.
And I
So
think in that case, it's also about boosting rest, so if your activities have to stay high due to family commitments, due to financial things, and for loads of people, of course, that is so, so true, um, then actually sometimes it can be, what can we do around sleep? What can we
mhm.
do around rest and really optimizing? So sleep is one of the big factors. And it's a very, very common symptom that's disrupted. So can we maximize that? Can we improve that? And can we improve the quality of your rest as well? So that actually, if you do get even that 15 minutes, if you do get 15 minutes to sit in your car, maybe between the school drop off and going to school, how can you find that to be a restful 15 minutes perhaps, that might just give you enough to kind of refresh you sufficiently to go and do the next thing. So rest doesn't always have to be, lying on your back listening to yoga nidras, like, can be, just a deep breath or a cup of tea and just clearing the mind, and I think just very, very much finding very practical ways to rest
Yeah.
is really important.
Definitely, that's such an important point around the sleep piece because, gosh, I'd say, from the people we speak to, children and adults, I'd say 99% of people have problems with their sleep. And, when
Yeah.
we look at spoon theory, often it's the difference between maybe if you start the day with 10 spoons versus on a week where actually your sleep problems are under control and you're getting
Yeah.
better rest, you're starting the day with 15 spoons. And it's really, or versus if you're having a very bad week, all that goes down. So yeah, I think that definitely can't be underestimated.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the high energy cost of being around high emotional expression, even on the phone and even on TV dramas? It's a really interesting question because you spoke about physical energy, cognitive energy, emotional energy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, very, 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 very real. Like, so whether it's on the phone, whether it's TV, even, and it's not necessarily even negative emotional expression, like, it can be, you know, your team wins a match, or, a really
Excitement.
lovely family event, or things like that. It's
Yeah.
not it necessarily, we associate it as, stress would drain our energy. I mean, anybody could understand that, but actually it seems to be something around the emotion. And
Yeah.
certainly what possibly might be, and I have to say this because, again, it's not an area that's massively well studied on its own, but it could be that tip between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sometimes when we get, sometimes when we get stressed, sometimes when we get scared, sometimes when we feel threatened, but also sometimes when we feel very excited or aroused or those sorts of things, there can be this tip between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So I think it's probably not just because it's huge, but it's that switch, between those two, and that switch also drives how our body generates energy from the available resources that it has. And so certainly things like our heart rate can increase, our consumption of those kind of basic fuels, if you like, increases in our demand for that. So it's definitely a thing. I think it's probably that sympathetic to parasympathetic switch.
Sure. Yeah. I think in my experience and with the children, my two kids have long COVID as well. And I mean, it's stress, distress, and excitement. I mean, they have a crash after every Christmas, after every birthday. So it definitely is positive emotions as well. And I think, one thing about watching TV as well, as I find, and my son does this, is he watches things he's seen before, and they take less emotional energy and cognitive energy, because obviously it can be difficult just to lie still with no kind of, sometimes people, depending on the situation. Another question, any advice how to manage extreme fatigue after eating? That's an interesting one.
I would say extreme fatigue after eating. So obviously to digest, blood flow has to go to your tummy and all around your digestive system. So very often people will experience extreme fatigue after eating, particularly after heavy carbohydrate-based meals. So they're quick to digest, but actually really quickly, that blood flow has to get there really quickly to manage that sudden burst of fuel that it's just had as an intake. So I would say definitely think about that from a carbs point of view. Is this quite a carbohydrate meal? And I think particularly having some quick meals that you can produce, or quick snacks that you can produce, that aren't just carbohydrate, because we do tend to reach for, something that's very like toast, or like something that's very, very quick, like a noodles, or, something that can go very quickly. So having a think about how can I reduce, so either having it with more fats or more proteins, or kind of reducing the amount of carbohydrate within that are two real culprits, definitely. So Bernie, yeah, my heart goes out to you, because it definitely is one. Somebody described it as it's the Christmas Day feeling every time I eat, so that Christmas Day we have these huge meals, 5 types of potatoes, and then everybody feels lethargic and tired. But it's like almost every time you eat, even if you have a snack at work, even if you have something like that, and it's very debilitating.
Tough one, definitely. I think this one will, a lot of people will feel this one. Any advice on how to manage to balance social situations and interactions with too much language processing that can cause pain? Gosh, I really feel like that. That you don't realize when you're listening if the radio's on in the background and the conversation as well.
Yeah, I think preparation probably is one of the big biggies. And by that, I mean preparing you and also as relevant to the people around you. I think very often when people don't know how to help, because it's an invisible disability, they don't necessarily, particularly around the cognitive language, those sorts of things, they might see you tired, they might see you look fatigued, but actually that sort of cognitive language, even the emotional stuff that Al mentioned as well, that's very hard for people to kind of get their heads around sometimes. I think preparing yourself, which I'll get on to, but also preparing the people that you're going to be with to say things like you just mentioned. Can we meet somewhere quiet? Because I actually find it's really hard. So could you come over to me perhaps, for example, because you can kind of control your environment a little bit more. Or, if it's going somewhere else, can I go somewhere where I can meet people one-on-one, for example, rather than as a big group? Because a lot of people find particularly group gatherings to be extra difficult. Other things they're thinking about, like another technique that actually can work well, particularly in a work situation, are things like priming. So priming is where we sort of activate that part of our brain so that there's a little bit of a recency effect almost, so that it's there ready to be used again. So I'll give you an example. So say, Sarah, you were meeting me for coffee and you hadn't met me in a long time, and you knew we were going to be talking about family, kids, work, whatever. An example would be of priming would be that you could think about me ahead of time, think about what my kids' names are, think about where I'm working now, think about those sorts of things, and actually just even jot them down. Even like, not that you're going to take out necessarily your notebook while we're meeting, but actually the priming of bringing those ideas to the fore and then writing them down actually helps with our memory, and it makes our recall of those types of things much easier in the moment. An example in a workplace might be that you make sure you are the best prepared person. So you actually read the minutes, because I work in a workplace where not everybody always reads the minutes and sort of comes in and wings it, So this can happen a lot. So, but by actually just reading the minutes, or by maybe reading the email where, somebody said, oh, we've got to meet to discuss sales, for quarter 3 or whatever, that you're priming that you're not trying to dredge it up, so that's another thing that can be done.
That's great.
Yeah, those sorts of things around managing that sensory overload as well can zone in on where you're at. And final thing I would say around language and cognition is positioning. Weirdly, again, something that people might necessarily think about, but where you're standing, again, if you have orthostatic issues, standing, the blood gravity literally pulls away from the brain, and we need lots of blood in our brain. It takes at least 20% of our blood flow. So if it's not getting what it needs to get, then you're going to really feel that cost in terms of your performance and your output, in terms of your cognition and in terms of your language. So it might be that actually what we do is we meet, we have a picnic, or I can lie in a picnic blanket, or we go somewhere where we know that there's going to be lots of seats, for us to sit and can kind of, relax on a couch or whatever, rather than managing it in that other way. So couple of different factors, but and again, of course, it's individual, but yeah, hopefully if you
Definitely. I think, obviously a lot of people might have heard of POTS, and I know that there's really fascinating doctor in the US who treats children with ME, and he kind of says, well, if the child doesn't have POTS, 99.9% of them have orthostatic intolerance, regardless. So, I think a lot of times people will say, if you have orthostatic intolerance, that's an issue. If you can be seated, be seated. If you can lie down somewhere, lie down somewhere. And I know Benita Kane had given really good advice about whether, if you're struggling with something cognitively, to lie down and raise the legs and try and get the kind of the blood circulating. I think that's actually a great idea if you're trying to socialize. Sometimes I find just, if you're already exhausted when you're still out, and you want to be chatting to people, but your blind just goes blank. You just can't think of the next thing to say. So that concept of priming is actually really interesting to me. But that actually, if you're in your own home or you're in a friend's home, to say, well, actually, I'm going to lay on the couch here like the Victorian lady while we chat, because my brain works better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where, context and just preparing people and just saying, you don't need to worry about me. This is, like, it's like, I'm fine, but I'm going to last longer if I can kind of relax and recline on the couch here while we have a chat. And I think to even, thinking about, as well, other ways to connect, like even you mentioned about kids or teenagers or things like that. So kind of, can you have a friend date where you just come together and watch a movie together, even if it's a rewatch of an old movie, those sorts of things, where there isn't necessarily as much, and he said this and I said that and we said the other, and that kind of, over and back, but that actually there's a vocal activity and you can just enjoy the togetherness of it, maybe. And again, very, very normal for teens to kind of be watching movies lying down, very normal. So those sorts of things.
And then I'm thinking as well, coming into the summer, I know a lot of people like the option to eat out if they're going to a restaurant, particularly obviously with COVID cases kind of rising at the moment. And I often find that kind of background noise that you get in a busy restaurant with a low ceiling is going to be particularly difficult. So actually taking it outside sometimes can be easier, and it's planning ahead. And, it's obviously not possible to bank huge amounts of energy, but you can plan for it in the sense that if you have a wedding or you have a communion, okay, I'm going to clear my diary Thursday and Friday and have quiet days, and I'm going to clear my diary on the Sunday and Monday and know that there's probably going to be a bit of, would that be fair to say, a bit of recovery? Or
Definitely. And I think as well, we just making sure, that you can kind of plan ahead, plan the recovery as well, and so, that you're not kind of adding additional onto that. And then also thinking about things like, like, you don't have to tell people everything. So you can take yourself off to the bathroom, for 20 minutes. And if there's a big group of people, they won't notice if you're gone for 5 minutes or 20 minutes. Really, they won't, So put down the seat, have a sit down, and just actually collect yourself as well, in the moment as relevant, it might be worth paying a little bit more to stay at the wedding venue or those sorts of things, and kind of thinking about trade-offs. I think living with long COVID, there's a lot of consideration around choices and trade-offs around some of those things as well. What is the most important part? If it was a wedding and you're like, it's actually too much for me to do the whole day, what is the most important part to you? Is it the speeches? Is it the getting weepy as they're walking down the aisle? Is it the bit of crack at the end of the night? And really thinking about, let me prioritize that bit and then think about the other bits. And again, communicating, just letting people know, I'm so happy to share your day, but I know I'm not going to be able to make all of it. I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the meal, something like that, and I think, most people get it, particularly if you, if you can kind of communicate it ahead of time. Sometimes communicating it in the moment can be hard. How do I find the time? I'm already depleted. I've already lost my words, and that's, sometimes a hard time to then call time on it,
yeah. I'm conscious of time, Ciara. Are you okay for 5 more minutes, or do you need to hop off? If you need to, that's
I'm
absolutely
okay
fine.
for 5 more minutes.
Okay,
I know
we'll
people.
just take one or two more then. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's such a good point. My son calls it word dead, when you just can't find the word. Can't finish that sentence. And Al's commenting there, it's so difficult to leave an outing in time and not get too tired to get up, leave and go home. Gosh, that really rings true with me. Like, you're sitting there and you're going, oh, I've now passed that point. The idea of getting in the car or getting a taxi.
Yes, absolutely. So hard. And I don't think, I think you can plan to a certain extent, but also there's so many variables in something like that, that it's just really, really difficult to do that. But again, having a plan for how am I going to get home, or maybe it is around, okay, what, I'm going to rearrange a taxi for 10:30, regardless, that kind of way, and just go enjoy that bit that I'm doing. And at least I know I've got a plan, but yeah, it's difficult,
Yeah. Okay, so then real quick. So difference between a crash and PEM.
Possibly none. Hard to say. I suppose crash is used across a lot of different chronic illnesses, so like definitely people with like somebody with rheumatoid arthritis might say, their joint flare is their flare of pain perhaps in their joints is, they might describe that as a crash. So crashes, I suppose, are more a colloquial term, really, more so than anything else. But mostly people refer to crashes as PEM, and I think that would be fair to say. And sometimes people will call it, I have a slow motion crash rather than so they're sometimes people will use it differently, but essentially I think very much if people have a very sudden deterioration in function, which most people refer to as crash, it's most likely PEM in this population.
Yeah. And the difference, I suppose, between, do you see any differences in how long COVID, PEM, the exhaustion that presents in children versus the adult kind of population?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I only typically would see more teens than younger kids, by and large, and that's just sort of a reflection of my clinical background more so than anything else. I think, and I suppose some of the differences that sort of there have been a couple of studies that have suggested that some kids might have some different symptoms. But I think at the level of the individual, it doesn't really help us, does it? Because any child or any adult could have headaches or gastro problems or POTS or, all sorts of things. So I think the range, when you study at a population level, maybe there are these changes, but certainly the differences between kids and teens that I've seen are as different as between some of the adults that I've seen. So I think certainly as a practitioner in the area, I need to take account of the person in front of me, that kind of way, and really see where they're at, look at what their specific, issues are, and build upwards from there. I do think, particularly in terms of re-education and rehab of teens, for example, obviously we're not dealing with say mature decision makers, so that part of their brain, that executive functioning hasn't kicked in yet. So I think in terms of learning pacing, in terms of kind of the planning, the prioritizing, all of those things that you'd ideally have if you're executing pacing, and to its nth degree. It's very hard to expect a 12-year-old to have the ability, maturity, the autonomy, to execute all of these things in that way. And so I think, for that, they might crash a little bit more often, just because I guess their read isn't always, or that ability to catch themselves, like Al was saying. We can all experience it, in terms of getting out of that outing in time. But if you're a kid and you've been longing, their peer group and everything is so important, on a developmental level as well as on a social level, and so they're hardwired to connect. They're hardwired to stay with their friends, be that online, be that in person. So I think their ability to execute pacing and things like that is maybe extra hard.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, I've been doing this for years with my ME, and I still, when you wake up and you feel so much better the day after a bad crash and the crash has kind of passed, oh, great, now I'm going to hop up, and it's so difficult to resist that instinct to catch up on the things you wanted to do. But I mean, it's an interesting point you make, but it's so individual, because I think for some of us who may have long COVID, and also our child has long COVID, your PEM symptoms may not be the same as your child's PEM symptoms. What triggers a PEM and you may not be the same for your child. And I know a lot of parents sometimes will find they're really struggling to figure out what was the trigger. And, you can kind of get caught in this. Am I getting a cold? Did I not sleep well? Did I do too much yesterday? Or was the day before? And I suppose at a certain point, it doesn't really matter, does it? You kind of have to just take what's in front of you and deal with the PEM and catch up.
I think so. And I think also as well, we kind of need to kind of maybe come at it from a kid's brain in some respects as well, and kind of go, like, if it matters to them, it's using their cognitive and emotional energy, that kind of way. So if it matters to them, it matters, so kind of saying, oh, it doesn't matter if you know, Tim can do a Rubik's Cube and you can't, or whatever. We're Rubik's Cube mad in this house at the moment. But, you know, it doesn't matter, but it does. And so that is then consuming, you know, cognitive and emotional energy, you know. So if it matters, it matters. And I think you just have to kind of, yeah, accept, you know, take people where they're at. And I suppose that's true for us all, really, and to some extent. And I think, you know, if it matters, it matters. Yeah.
Okay, definitely. Well, listen, I'm conscious I've run over a good bit, but I thank you so much, Ciara. It's been so incredibly helpful. I think we could probably chat for a couple of hours. There's so much to this, and this is kind of almost feel like we're just touching the surface of you know, people's day-to-day kind of queries and that. But I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everybody on the call.